History does not end in the aftermath of World War II. Archives were sealed, testimonies erased, and truths deliberately buried beneath decades of silence. What the public came to know was only a carefully curated version of events, shaped by victors and concealed by those who feared the destabilizing power of full disclosure. Beneath the surface, however, lay fragments of darker files, documents stamped with the ominous phrases "Nur für den Dienstgebrauch" in Berlin, "Osobaya Papka" in Moscow, and "Most Secret" in London. These records, often partially burned, heavily redacted, or mislabeled to obscure their significance, held details of operations so cruel and unrestrained that neither side of the conflict wished them remembered. Scattered intelligence reports, intercepted communique, survivor testimonies smuggled out under false names, and forgotten photographs all point to a deeper undercurrent of warfare, one where civilian populations were weaponized, where secret rail lines vanished into night, where experiments on human beings reached levels beyond moral comprehension, and where entire groups were silenced with the complicity of international powers. This is not the war history printed in textbooks or commemorated at memorials. These are files pried open from steel cabinets rusting in forgotten bunkers, stories whispered in interrogation rooms, and secrets so volatile that disclosure was considered more dangerous than silence. What you are about to hear are 4 events deliberately buried, each one carefully concealed not only during the war, but for decades after, until fragments of evidence escaped suppression. They are horrifying not because they are unbelievable, but because they are entirely real. With victory parades or the signing of surrender documents. It lingers in the sealed files, the missing archives, and the testimonies that never reach the witness stand. The revelations of Operation Iron Wolf, the biological weapons program of Gruinard Island, the ghost convoys of the Baltic, and the clandestine bargains of Operation Sunrise form not just hidden chapters of the Second World War, but foundations of the uneasy world that followed. They show us that war is never fought solely with tanks and rifles, but also with silence, deception, and moral compromise. When governments declare their innocence, archives whisper otherwise. When leaders speak of honor, their secret memoranda betray the calculations of survival. The unanswered questions remain. How many more files lie buried? How many packs remain unacknowledged? How many voices were silenced before they could speak? In the dim corridors of intelligence agencies, in the rusted wrecks beneath the Baltic, and in the soil of an island once poisoned with anthrax, history waits for those willing to listen. These truths, long suppressed, remind us that the war never truly ended. It merely changed form, carried forward into the rivalries and betrayals of the Cold War and beyond. What was hidden then continues to cast its shadow now, urging us to look closer, to question deeper, and to understand that the cost of silence is often greater than the cost of war itself. Chapter 1: Shadows of Operation Iron Wolf. In the spring of 1944, as the Eastern Front collapsed under the relentless Soviet advance, the German High Command authorized a desperate series of covert actions designed to delay the Red Army and terrorize populations viewed as collaborators. Among the most chilling of these was Operation Iron Wolf, a mission erased from most surviving Wehrmacht records, yet faintly visible in fragments of dispatches, intercepted orders, and Gestapo reports. The operation was carried out in the dense forests and marshlands of Belarus, near the cities of Vitebsk and Minsk, regions already ravaged by years of occupation. Under Himmler's direct authorization, SS Totenkopf divisions were reassigned to logistical clearance duties, a phrase concealing a calculated campaign of famine, forced displacement and chemical contamination. Officially, the orders described Iron Wolf as a counterinsurgency operation aimed at dismantling partisan networks. But Soviet archives later revealed the chilling intent: to create uninhabitable zones behind German lines, eradicating not only resistance cells, but also the civilian populations that sustained them. German field units were instructed to encircle villages under cover of night, confiscating livestock, destroying food reserves, and contaminating wells with crude agents derived from stockpiles of industrial chemicals. These were not sophisticated biological weapons, but arsenic compounds and crude mixtures designed to poison crops and water supplies, rendering entire communities unlivable. Captured Soviet intelligence notes, filed under NKVD Archive 73-11, describe survivors fleeing burning villages, only to collapse days later from dehydration and poisoning. The tactical logic was brutal. Starve the partisan fighters by annihilating their support base, then withdraw, leaving only scorched earth behind. Reports intercepted by Soviet partisans noted the cold precision of the operation, with one SS commander writing that the wolf leaves no trail but silence. It was an erasure strategy, one designed to deny even the memory of those it destroyed. The silence of German officers themselves betrays the operation's horrors. In declassified Allied interrogation transcripts, an Oberleutnant recalled the orders delivered by courier. No witnesses, no records, clearance in full. He later admitted under questioning that many within the Wehrmacht found the brutality unbearable. Yet questioning the orders carried its own punishment. A lieutenant stationed near Minsk who expressed disgust was abruptly transferred to the Western Front, his fate sealed within weeks in the chaos of Normandy. His name was struck from subsequent division reports, a subtle warning to others who might resist the directives. In this climate, Iron Wolf advanced unchecked, a hidden policy of annihilation, masquerading as routine anti-partisan warfare. By July 1944, Soviet forces advancing westward began encountering the remnants of the operation. Entire villages were reduced to ash, with skeletal remains scattered in abandoned fields. Wells were discovered poisoned with lime and crude phenol mixtures, their stone rims stained with chemical residue. Survivors, mostly children and the elderly, spoke in fragmented testimony of men in black uniforms sealing homes and barns before setting them ablaze. One Soviet field surgeon recorded the case of a boy whose skin bore chemical burns consistent with exposure to caustic agents not normally found in combat operations. The NKVD compiled these accounts into a classified dossier, but Stalin himself ordered it suppressed under the label Osobaya Papka, fearing the disclosure would incite panic and complicate Soviet propaganda efforts. The Soviet leadership preferred to highlight German brutality in more conventional atrocities, leaving Iron Wolf buried beneath layers of secrecy. When the Nuremberg trials commenced in late 1945, prosecutors faced an overwhelming flood of evidence concerning German war crimes. Yet Iron Wolf was conspicuously absent. British intelligence officers had already intercepted fragments of the German files, but they quietly categorized them under not for public record. MI6 communiques, discovered decades later, reveal the reasoning. Acknowledgement of deliberate chemical contamination against civilians could undermine Allied narratives of moral superiority and complicate post-war treaties governing chemical warfare. Instead, Iron Wolf's records were quietly sealed within NATO's restricted archives in Brussels, transferred from one filing system to another until their very existence was obscured. Even among survivors, testimony was muffled. Those who spoke of poisoned wells or chemical burns were often dismissed as mistaken or misled, their accounts overshadowed by the already vast catalogue of Nazi atrocities. Yet the traces never fully vanished. In 1989, amid the crumbling Soviet Union, partial declassification of NKVD records revealed references to Iron Wolf. A memo from Commissar Beria to Stalin described intercepted German orders to neutralize agricultural villages by liquid measures. The choice of wording was unmistakable. Independent historians who gained access to these files in Moscow pieced together fragments of what had happened. One noted the deliberate vagueness of German military communications, the repeated use of terms like clearance, sterilization, and wolf silence. Each was a euphemism designed to obscure the true scope of the operation. Soviet archivists who handled these documents remarked on the chilling precision of the orders, noting that they read less like battlefield directives and more like administrative checklists for extermination. The scale of the operation remains contested. Conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands perished across Belarus during Iron Wolf, either through direct execution, starvation, or chemical poisoning. Local records, painstakingly reconstructed from parish lists and censuses, show entire villages erased from official maps. Survivors were often too few or too traumatized to maintain collective memory. For decades, their voices were scattered, fragmented across regions, unrecognized by the broader narrative of the war. Only in recent years have researchers begun to assemble these fragments into a cohesive account, one that points unmistakably to Operation Iron Wolf as a deliberate policy of eradication. One haunting motif recurs in both German and Soviet fragments: the wolf itself. German commanders spoke of hunting the wolf in his den, a metaphor for partisans. Yet the operation's codename carried a darker resonance. The wolf, in folklore, is both predator and phantom, feared not only for its strength, but for the silence it leaves behind. Iron Wolf lived up to its name, not only as an operation of extermination, but as an attempt to erase memory itself. Where it passed, silence followed. A silence that lasted decades, broken only by the faint echo of declassified files. As late as the 1970s, villagers in rural Belarus would point to poisoned wells, warning children never to drink from them. They spoke of the wolf's water, a folk memory of contamination that persisted long after the operation itself was forgotten in official records. Anthropologists later identified this oral tradition as one of the few surviving testimonies of Iron Wolf, an unbroken thread linking present generations to the terror of 1944. It was not history written in books, but memory etched into the land itself. The suppressed truth of Operation Iron Wolf raises disturbing questions about the limits of wartime memory. If such an operation could be concealed for decades, its evidence scattered across rival intelligence services, what other atrocities remain sealed behind locked cabinets and redacted files? The fragments we possess tell of famine weaponized as strategy, of chemicals turned against civilians, and of entire communities erased under the guise of logistical clearance. It was a campaign deemed too destabilizing to acknowledge at Nuremberg, too dangerous to disclose during the Cold War, and too horrifying for survivors to carry openly. Yet buried or not, the wolf's shadow lingers, a reminder of the dark depths to which total war descended. Chapter 2: The Black Trains of Auschwitz Corridor. In the winter of 1942, as Nazi Germany intensified its genocidal machinery, an unmarked rail line was constructed across Silesia, known in internal correspondence as Strecke 0, Line 0. It never appeared on official maps, timetables, or transport manifests. Buried within the archives of the Polish state railways and cross-referenced in fragments of Gestapo traffic files, this rail corridor represented an alternate system of deportation, one designed to bypass even the already clandestine Auschwitz transport structure. Unlike the documented cattle trains whose timetables were captured and preserved after the war, Strecke 0 carried no passenger lists, no written orders, and no surviving administrative record of its human cargo. It was, by all available evidence, a phantom railway designed to move the unaccounted detainees, those too dangerous, too politically sensitive, or too experimental for even the main camp system to absorb. The trains themselves were painted black, stripped of any insignia, and modified for silence. Survivors from nearby towns testified decades later that they moved only at night, shrouded in mist and smoke, passing through rural stations where civilian workers were forbidden to approach. Windows were sealed from the inside with sheet metal, doors bolted from outside. Soviet counterintelligence units advancing in 1945 collected testimonies from displaced workers who recalled hearing muffled cries or fists pounding against the iron panels as the trains rolled past. Some wagons, they noted, leaked a faint stench of chemicals, a detail suggesting that many of the prisoners may not have survived their transport. The railmen referred to them in whispers as the Black Wagons, a designation echoed in NKVD Archive 11247, which catalogued interviews with Polish civilians along the corridor. Documentation is fragmentary but chilling. In early 1940, SS-Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler, already notorious for overseeing underground weapons projects, appears in railway correspondence under the pseudonym Baudirektor K. His role was to coordinate the logistics of secret construction near Katowice, where tunnels were blasted deep into the bedrock. Allied aerial reconnaissance photographed segments of this construction, yet the images were officially catalogued by the British Air Ministry as civilian freight infrastructure. Declassified memos now show this was a deliberate act of mislabeling. Prime Minister Churchill himself received a private briefing from intelligence officers who warned that disclosure of these images would risk revealing atrocities too destabilizing to surface. The order was clear. The photographs would be filed under restricted, non-operational. The human cargo of Strecke 0 remains one of the most disturbing mysteries. Testimonies collected after the war suggest the trains did not head toward Auschwitz's main gates, but branched south into the forests outside Katowice. There, a labyrinth of bunkers and shafts, later flooded and sealed, awaited. Soviet soldiers entering the area in 1945 discovered collapsed tunnels lined with charred timber, their entrances packed with explosives. NKVD engineers reported a foul stench emanating from fissures in the earth. yet excavation was halted under direct orders. Stalin, already preparing propaganda centered on Auschwitz, considered the exposure of an alternate extermination network a potential distraction from the Soviet narrative. The tunnels were sealed, and the reports filed under classified indefinitely. A survivor's account from 1961 provides one of the few first-hand glimpses inside a black train. A Polish resistance courier arrested near Krakow described being loaded into a sealed wagon without air vents. He noted an unbearable chemical odor saturating the wooden slats, causing many prisoners to vomit and collapse before departure. After 2 days of transit, he awoke alone in a siding, the rest of the prisoners gone. He claimed to have been mistakenly transferred out by an SS officer who realized he carried forged documents linked to the Underground Railway unions, a political value that may have saved him. His testimony, preserved by the Polish Institute of National Remembrance, speaks of the silence inside the wagon, the way pounding fists grew weaker until only the groan of the steel wheels remained. He called it the train of silence, though his interrogators later matched it with references to Strecke Null. British intelligence maintained its own files. Declassified MI6 communiqués from 1944 refer obliquely to special trains of political consignment moving through Silesia. One cable, labeled Most Secret and addressed to the War Office, specifically warns that confirmation of these transports could destabilize ongoing Allied unity. The implication was clear. Even as Allied leaders condemned the camps, they feared the full exposure of an unrecorded extermination route would fracture public trust in the war's moral justification. For decades, the subject was taboo. Historians who pursued it found doors closed, archives restricted, or documents missing. Only in 1973, when East German archivists uncovered fragments of Polish railway logs, did the shape of Strecke Null emerge again. The fragments showed not timetables, but fuel requisitions for locomotives traveling unregistered night routes. Fuel that disappeared from official accounting, yet was consistently requisitioned in the months leading up to Auschwitz's peak operations. The absence of records is its own kind of evidence. Unlike the Auschwitz transports, which left trails of paper across Reichsbahn offices, Strecke Null was designed for obliteration. Orders were verbal, logs destroyed at the end of each month, and surviving witnesses silenced either by execution or by fear. Even today, few physical remains of the line survive. Sections of rusted track discovered in the 1980s near Tarnowski Gori led investigators to suspect a hidden branch. But excavation was repeatedly halted by local authorities citing safety concerns. Rumors persist that underground vaults still hold human remains, locked within collapsed chambers that were deliberately flooded by retreating SS units. Whether by design or accident, these tunnels remain untouched, their secrets sealed beneath layers of stone and earth. The black trains of Auschwitz corridor represent not merely another atrocity, but a deliberate erasure from history. Unlike other Nazi crimes, documented extensively through bureaucratic obsession, this operation was shrouded in silence from inception. Its existence depended on secrecy, its function on the absence of records. Survivors were not meant to exist, and indeed, almost none did. Those who caught fleeting glimpses remembered black iron wagons gliding through the night, carrying faceless victims to destinations that no map acknowledged. It was a parallel system, a corridor of disappearance, and a chilling reminder that even within the machinery of genocide, there were darker layers still hidden. For decades, the story of Strecke Null was treated as rumor, a phantom whispered in survivor accounts and dismissed by official historians. Only with the piecing together of railway fragments, intelligence memos, and oral testimonies has a clearer picture begun to emerge. The trains were real, the line existed, and the tunnels near Katowice hold secrets that the world has never been allowed to see. In the silence of those sealed shafts lies a truth that was too horrifying for victors and vanquished alike to confront. A truth deliberately buried, yet never erased, waiting beneath the earth for recognition that may never fully come. Chapter 3. The Siberian Plague Detachment Files. In the frozen expanse east of Irkutsk, where permafrost grips the earth and winter devours the horizon, fragments of declassified Soviet files tell of an atrocity buried deeper than the snow that concealed it. In 1941, at the height of Japan's occupation of Manchuria, a covert mission linked to the infamous Unit 731 penetrated beyond the border. It was codenamed Detachment Kurotsuki, a name derived from the Japanese word for black moon, chosen to symbolize operations that were never to see daylight. The collaborators were renegade White Russian officers, exiles embittered since the Bolshevik Revolution, who guided Japanese operatives through frozen rivers and hidden trails across Siberia. What they established was no ordinary military outpost, according to Soviet Ministry of Defense dossiers, stamped with the Scarlet Mark. Osobaya Papka, these men constructed, a series of makeshift laboratories in abandoned logging settlements where experiments rivaling the darkest chapters of human cruelty were conducted. Captured NKVD reports describe test subjects as politically suspect elements, captured partisans, and Chinese laborers seized from Manchuria. Prisoners were confined in crude wooden barracks where temperatures fell below -40 degrees. Victims were deliberately exposed to plague bacilli, cholera strains, and frostbite conditions designed to test human endurance against both infection and cold. Soviet engineers later unearthed pits filled with lime-covered corpses, their flesh preserved unnaturally by the Siberian frost. Reports noted shattered bones where restraints had been broken, teeth clenched in expressions of agony frozen into permanence. The disposal method was systematic. Bodies were doused in kerosene, ignited, and then covered with snow to mask the smoke. Yet the permafrost betrayed the secrecy, preserving both evidence and victims for decades to come. Communication between the field detachments and Tokyo was routed through Harbin, using encrypted codes carried by trusted couriers. Fragments of decoded transmissions found in Soviet files revealed chillingly clinical updates. Batch 14 succumbed in 36 hours. Lesions advanced as predicted. Batch 21 exposed to Bacillus Yersinia pestis. Mortality confirmed. Each report ended with the notation, "Material secured," an expression Soviet analysts later interpreted as references to organ and tissue samples transported back to Japan. The precision of these reports, contrasted with the absence of names, transformed human suffering into mere data points. Stalin, briefed on the findings in late 1942, ordered the entire dossier sealed. He feared that disclosure would spark terror among Soviet citizens, already anxious over rumors of chemical and biological warfare. The directive was absolute, no mention, not even to Politburo. What is particularly disturbing is the afterlife of these files. In 1952, as tensions rose in Korea, fragments of Kurotsky's research surfaced in CIA archives under the codename Project Cedar. These were obtained not through open trials, but through covert exchanges, as American intelligence quietly shielded Japanese doctors from prosecution in exchange for their data. Among the files was evidence that frostbite resistance, tests, prisoners forced to stand barefoot in snow until their limbs turned black, were being re-examined by US military, researchers exploring cold weather combat. The irony was bitter. Experiments condemned as crimes in Nuremberg were simultaneously being recycled as assets in a new geopolitical rivalry. Soviet investigators, aware of this betrayal, maintained silence publicly, unwilling to expose their own failures along the Siberian border. The few witnesses who spoke did so decades later, under anonymity. One former NKVD guard interviewed in 1988 described intercepting a detachment camp after its hasty evacuation. He recalled entering barracks where glass jars lined the walls, each containing preserved organs floating in cloudy liquid. "They left in a hurry," he said, "but the dead remained to testify." The guard described the silence of the site, broken only by the crack of shifting ice. Among the documents recovered was a notebook containing kanji notations beside rows of numbers. The NKVD concluded it was a ledger of experiments, but Stalin's secrecy order ensured the notebook was placed into storage, vanishing into the vaults of Moscow until researchers rediscovered it decades later. The complicity of White Russian collaborators added another layer of betrayal. These men, former officers of the Imperial Russian Army, had lived in exile since the revolution, nursing hatred for the Soviet regime. In Kurotsky, they saw opportunity, not merely for survival but for revenge. They provided local knowledge of terrain, guiding Japanese operatives to safe crossings and abandoned mines that could be converted into laboratories. Some served directly as guards, overseeing prisoners they regarded as Soviet traitors. After the war, many of these collaborators disappeared, their identities erased or absorbed into Western intelligence operations. A handful resurfaced in Argentina and Brazil under new names, their pasts buried alongside the victims they betrayed. What remains most haunting about Detachment Kurotsky is the deliberate destruction of evidence. Soviet engineers reported hearing explosive detonations in the taiga during their pursuit, signs that the Japanese had collapsed tunnel systems to erase their presence. Aerial reconnaissance later confirmed scorched earth patterns where settlements once stood, yet the permafrost preserved what fire could not. In the 1970s, geologists drilling for oil near Irkutsk unearthed a mass grave containing skeletal remains, bound with leather straps, still bearing traces of surgical incisions. Though the discovery was officially attributed to civilian casualties of war, internal reports linked the site to Kurotsuki's activities. The files were once again sealed, reinforcing the cycle of concealment that has defined this story from its beginning. Even now, historians struggle to quantify the scope of the operation. Conservative estimates suggest hundreds, possibly thousands, perished in these frozen laboratories. Their deaths were never acknowledged, their identities erased, their remains scattered beneath ice and snow. What endures are only fragments, coded transmissions, intercepted orders, testimonies whispered across decades, and the grim consistency of oral histories in Siberian villages, where locals still speak of the Black Doctors who came with the winter and left with the thaw. It is a memory buried in silence, yet persistent enough to unsettle those who listen. The Siberian Plague Detachment files force us to confront uncomfortable truths, not only about Japan's Unit 731, but about the willingness of global powers to exploit atrocity in the name of strategy. Stalin's suppression, America's covert acquisition of research, and the deliberate erasure of collaborators all ensured that justice would never be served. What remains is a shadow, cast long across the snowbound wilderness, whispering of laboratories without names and victims without graves. The black moon of Kurotsuki set long ago, but its darkness lingers still, hidden within the archives and frozen earth of Siberia. Chapter 4: The Forgotten Massacre at Bleiburg Ridge. In May 1945, with the Third Reich collapsing into ruins, tens of thousands of men, women and children fled toward Austria. They were Croatian Ustaše, Slovenian Domobranci, Serbian Chetniks, and civilians. Families bound to those factions, fearing the vengeance of advancing Yugoslav partisans. They marched westward in desperate columns, hoping to surrender not to Tito's forces, but to the British stationed near the Austrian town of Bleiburg. Their hope was simple: to be treated as prisoners of war under Allied protection. What awaited them was betrayal written in the language of diplomacy and concealed in archives for decades. MI6 communiques declassified in the 1990s reveal that British commanders had already struck a covert understanding with Tito's envoys. In exchange for Yugoslav cooperation in post-war stabilization, entire columns of surrendering forces would be repatriated. That term, deceptively bureaucratic, concealed a reality far bloodier. Repatriation meant forced return to Yugoslavia, where summary executions awaited. British reports filed under Most Secret described the scene at Bleiburg Ridge on May 15, 1945. Witnesses recall long columns stretching across the fields, white flags raised in surrender, only to be surrounded by armed partisans. Survivors later testified that machine gun fire echoed without pause for days, mowing down exhausted prisoners as they laid down their arms. Civilians who had followed their husbands and fathers were not spared. Women and children were driven into forced marches that soon became death processions. These routes, later named the Way of the Cross, wound through forests and ravines where execution squads waited in ambush. Villagers along the paths described the stench of decay that lingered for months. The shallow graves filled hurriedly with bodies, many still bound at the wrists. The scale defied comprehension. Estimates range from 50,000 to over 100,000 dead, their fates erased from official Western accounts. Yugoslav military dispatches recovered after Tito's death provide chilling confirmation. One order referred to the liquidation of fascist remnants and instructed units to avoid leaving survivors who might testify. Intercepted partisan communications archived by the CIA echo the same brutal language. Yet officially, the massacre never existed. British field officers, aware of the executions, filed reports that were deliberately sanitized. One intelligence officer described the return of prisoners as a population transfer, a term that disguised mass killings under administrative neutrality. His private diary, discovered by his family decades later, told a different story. "We delivered them to slaughter, unarmed and unknowing. Their cries will not leave me." This diary entry, hidden until the officer's death, became one of the few authentic first-hand acknowledgements from the Allied side. The survivors who endured the Way of the Cross carried scars that words could scarcely convey. Many described being marched without food or water for days, collapsing only to be shot on the roadside. Others recounted forests echoing with gunfire as entire groups were led away under the pretense of relocation. Mothers carried infants until exhaustion forced them to abandon the dead by the roadside. Those who lived did so often by slipping away under cover of night, wandering for weeks before reaching safety. Testimonies preserved in exile communities across Canada, Argentina, and Australia speak of the same recurring images: the ridge at Bleiburg, the endless marches, the unmarked graves. For decades, these testimonies were dismissed as exaggerations or politically motivated fabrications. The silence was reinforced both by Western governments, unwilling to stain their alliance with Tito, and by Yugoslavia itself, where discussion of Bleiburg was punishable by imprisonment. The Cold War deepened the silence. For the West, Tito's Yugoslavia was a valuable buffer state against Soviet influence, and acknowledging complicity in mass executions risked destabilizing that balance. Files remained sealed in London, Vienna, and Washington. Survivors and émigré organizations who pressed for recognition found doors closed, archives locked, and scholars warned away from the subject. It was not until the 1980s, as Yugoslavia began to fracture, that the massacre re-emerged in public discourse. Exhumations of mass graves in Slovenia uncovered skeletal remains consistent with execution-style killings. Skulls shattered by close-range gunfire, wrists bound with wire. Each excavation confirmed what survivors had said for decades, yet the scale of the graves only deepened the horror. One site alone yielded over 3,000 bodies, buried in shallow pits along the forest edge. MI6 documents declassified in the late 20th century revealed the truth long suspected. Orders from the War Office instructed officers at Bleiburg to accept surrenders for immediate repatriation. The language was deliberate, ensuring that responsibility would be deflected onto Yugoslav forces. Yet British officers knew precisely what awaited those returned. Some officers protested in private, but their objections were overruled by higher command, citing political necessity. The calculus was cold. Securing Tito's cooperation outweighed the fate of tens of thousands. The massacre was not a spontaneous act of vengeance, but the outcome of deliberate policy. It was a decision made in conference rooms, translated into sanitized communiques, and executed in blood on the fields of Bleiburg. The memory of Bleiburg Ridge persists as a wound across generations. For Croatians, Slovenians, and Serbians whose families vanished in 1945, the massacre became a forbidden memory, whispered in exile, but suppressed at home. In Yugoslavia, state propaganda portrayed all those killed as fascist collaborators, erasing the presence of civilians and non-combatants. Memorials were forbidden, discussion criminalized. It was only after Tito's death in 1980 that fragments of the truth began to surface, though even then the subject remained deeply divisive. Each exhumed grave, each rediscovered document, confirmed that the massacre was not an isolated tragedy, but one of the largest single acts of post-war reprisal in Europe. The forgotten massacre at Bleiburg Ridge challenges the comfortable boundaries between victor and villain, justice and atrocity. It forces recognition of a betrayal written not in the language of enemies, but of allies. Tens of thousands who surrendered in good faith were condemned by secret agreements and executed without trial. Their deaths were hidden behind euphemisms like population transfer, their graves left unmarked, their voices silenced. Yet the silence could not last forever. As archives opened and graves were unearthed, the truth emerged, fragmented, contested, but undeniable. It is a reminder that even in the war's final days, cruelty did not end with peace. For many, the end of the war was the beginning of another nightmare, one deliberately concealed from history's record. The ridge at Bleiburg remains quiet today, the fields green and undisturbed. Yet beneath the soil lie thousands who marched west in hope and met death instead. Their story was meant to vanish, erased by secrecy and necessity, but the ground remembers, the archives whisper, and the survivors' testimonies echo across decades. Bleiburg Ridge is not merely a forgotten battlefield. It is a scar, hidden yet unhealed, marking the place where surrender turned into massacre under the watchful silence of those who claimed to bring liberation. In the decades following World War II, history became a carefully constructed narrative, leaving countless atrocities buried beneath official silence, classified files, and strategic omissions. What the public remembers, the battles, the liberation, the trials, is only a fraction of the full story, sanitized to fit moral frameworks and geopolitical interests. Yet beneath the surface, the shadows of events such as Operation Iron Wolf, the black trains of Auschwitz corridor, the Siberian plague detachment, and the Bleiburg Ridge massacre persist. These are not merely historical curiosities, but stark reminders of human cruelty facilitated by bureaucracy, ideology, and indifference. Each suppressed operation was meticulously planned, executed with precision, and subsequently erased from public memory, leaving only fragments for historians and investigators to reconstruct decades later. The archives, whether in Berlin, Moscow, London, or Warsaw, are filled with redacted reports, destroyed transport manifests, sealed laboratory notes, and eyewitness testimonies that were hidden under layers of state secrecy. The unresolved nature of these events forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the mechanisms of concealment and complicity. How many other atrocities were similarly hidden, their evidence lost to time or deliberately destroyed? How many survivors remained silent, too fearful or traumatized to testify? Even today, as researchers uncover partial records and mass graves, there are always gaps, inconsistencies, and mysteries that will likely never be fully resolved. The very act of remembering these suppressed histories challenges the neat moral narratives of victory and defeat, forcing recognition of the grey spaces where ethics, power, and fear intersected with deadly consequences. The long-buried files remind us that history is not a fixed story, but an ongoing excavation, a careful unearthing of truths deliberately obscured, and that memory itself can be weaponized, silenced, or manipulated. As the shadows of these events resurface, we are confronted with both horror and responsibility. It is the historian's task, the investigator's duty, and the citizen's challenge to acknowledge these suppressed truths, to reconstruct the lives erased, and to understand the full scope of human capacity for cruelty when secrecy shields intent. The echoes of Operation Iron Wolf, the black trains, Korotsky's laboratories, and Bleiburg Ridge continue to reverberate, haunting the landscapes of Europe and Siberia, the pages of archives, and the collective consciousness of survivors and descendants. They demand remembrance not only as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder that silence can be as destructive as the acts themselves, that buried history is never truly gone, and that uncovering it is essential to the pursuit of truth, justice, and moral accountability.